All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 12, Manifest Destiny. So the textbook defines manifest destiny as a quasi religious call to spread democracy with settlement of the West. And, manifest destiny sometimes can be a little bit tricky of a term to define, but this definition does a pretty good job of kind of touching on some of the major points behind manifest destiny. Kind of in its more simplistic form, when we refer to manifest destiny, we simply refer to westward expansion. Now, there had been different periods in American history and different periods in colonial history where westward expansion applied. But in this period here, right on the eve or right before the Civil War, essentially what we mean by the West, at least here, is here west really means west of the Mississippi. So, for example, when the first European settlers settled in Jamestown, west was just Western Virginia. For a lot of the colonial period, west was west of the Appalachian Mountains. So, places like Ohio and Indiana, those would have been considered west. Well, by the time we're on the cusp of the American Civil War, what we mean by west is anything that is west of the Mississippi River. We have a quote here. It says, quote, "Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the development of our yearly multiplying millions." John O. Sullivan, 1845. Um, so, manifest destiny is this notion or idea that was very powerful and influential for for many Americans, and it rests primarily on a couple of justifications, right? Why did the United States seek to spread westward? Well, we can identify primarily three things. One was that simply the power or maybe the strength justified expansion. The United States was a powerful enough nation that it should incorporate the Western territories. Another point is about economics in terms of like resources. You might refer to this as agriculture, cultural development. We'll use your textbook sort of labels it this way: development. Development. Let's try that again. And sometimes this is referred to as quote unquote civilization. So it definitely is a theme of kind of improving technology, turning what is kind of frontier territory, a land that is not that viable economically, bringing in technology, agricultural development, and then making it worth something, right? So there's sort of an economic incentive. And then the last one was to spread what we might say culture or ideologies, and that is to spread Christianity and democracy, which most Americans at this point believed were good things. And so when we think about kind of the three pillars that manifest destiny stands on, typically civilization, Christianity, and democracy. And so the idea that all Americans could agree that all these three were good things and that they should be spread to every inch of the Western continent, that was reason enough for many Americans to get behind manifest destiny, despite the fact that many Americans had a lot of differences at this time. In fact, one group or organization kind of best represented this notion of Americans finding manifest destiny useful because it was one thing that all Americans could agree upon, North and South, for example. That's kind of the biggest division, North and South. And that was the Young American movement. And the Young American movement embraced westward expansion as a way to distract is probably a good word here, um, the country from other internal issues. And of course, chief among them is the issue of slavery. So, whereas Northerners and Southerners were increasingly becoming hostile towards one another as the years went on, and as the American Civil War is kind of right on the horizon here, Manifest Destiny was an opportunity for Americans to put aside their differences and sort of embrace and pursue something that had pretty widespread support. Now, not everybody was kind of keen to the Young American movement and sort of people that were associated with that. One of them was Abraham Lincoln, who kind of pointed out some of the maybe contradictions or pointed out some of the flaws in the way that westward expansion was being used. We might say about Lincoln, who was somewhat of a critic of the Young Americans. Lincoln would have been someone who, again, this was a constituency that was growing over time, would have prioritized, the issue of slavery over something like westward expansion. And so he has kind of a pretty sly quote here that kind of shows maybe his somewhat pessimistic attitudes towards what groups like the Young Americans were advocating for. So he says here, quote, "He is a great friend of humanity." He's referring to a young American, right? Somebody who's encouraging westward expansion. Says he is a great friend of humanity. His desire for land is not selfish, but merely an impulse to extend the area of freedom. He is anxious to fight for liberation, provided always they have land. As those who have no land, well, they can afford to wait a few hundred years longer. Abraham Lincoln, 1859. So what Lincoln is saying here is saying, look, this sort of call to spread liberty, this call to spread democracy, Lincoln is a little bit kind of suspicious of that and says, look, it's quite convenient that the calls for freedom and the calls for liberation are in those places where like land is valuable. And for those people that don't have land, well, freedom and liberty and democracy aren't quite as important. So he was a little bit maybe more skeptical. But majority of Americans were not quite where Lincoln is at, right? Very much supportive of it. Now, when we think about manifest destiny, certainly that definition that your textbook provides is very helpful. But in many ways, manifest destiny might be better defined by this image here. And this image kind of does a great job of encapsulating all of the features that manifest destiny entails. So we have an image here of the American frontier. We have the West, and we have kind of like American society. And we've identified, or we're going to identify kind of three things and how they relate to the overall picture of manifest destiny. So the first one is the central figure here, an angel. And if the angel wasn't enough, you also have themes of light and dark, or good and evil. This represents the religious component of manifest destiny, right? Sort of this idea of good versus evil, the notion of spreading Christianity. And, there was a religious element to this. It wasn't just about the money, right? A lot of times we like to simplify things and say, well, isn't it all just about the money? Well, not necessarily. The angel figure, and this is probably the more difficult kind of part to grasp from this image, but what the angel figure is wearing is sort of the garb of what a Roman politician might wear. And what that is supposed to represent, that's supposed to represent uh, more broadly or more specifically republicanism give myself more room. Republicanism. And this, of course, is something like democracy, and all of the American ideals like liberty, freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So here we have the spreading of kind of very important American values that, again, most Americans would agree that liberty is good, democracy is good, freedom is good. Now, they might have different ideas of what those things mean, but as long as we are getting behind supporting these ideas, then yeah, spreading democracy is also a good thing. And then lastly, we have some images of things like a train, a what we might call a market farm or a farm that has been kind of like scientifically managed. We have in the background steamships and bridges. We see that this angel figure is actually quite literally carrying telegraph wire, right? Kind of a interesting combination between technology and religiosity. But this is supposed to represent the civilization aspect of it, right? This idea of development, to take land that is, barren and wilderness and turn it into something profitable, right? This would be the economic incentive. So, kind of the three pillars, the religious component, the democratic component, and the economic component. These are the ways in which Americans supported and endorsed westward expansion. Section 2, Antebellum westward migration and Indian removal. So we're introduced with a quote here from Horace Greeley, which, as kind of a slogan of the era, was very much popularized. Greeley said in 1841, "There is room and health in the country, away from the crowds of idlers and imbeciles," kind of referring to mass urbanization that had taken place in the cities. Greeley says, "Go west before you are fitted for no life but the factory." So, westward expansion could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. At least, kind of encapsulated in Greeley's quote here, is that it could definitely be an escape from, in this case, urban society. And Americans would very much understand the West as being kind of like an escape hatch, right? Or a release valve that no matter how bad things may have gotten, you always have a chance as an American to start over new by moving westward. So this sort of phrase, "Go west," specifically "Go west, young man," was a popular saying, right? And it's kind of lived on in the American popular imagination since then. So, as far as westward expansion goes, there are several kind of areas that one could potentially focus on. The example provided in the textbook is the case of Florida, the story about how Florida comes or becomes incorporated in the United States. Now, Florida had been for a very long time a Spanish colony. I'd say about Florida, it was controlled by Spain. Really, up until this point, we're in the early 1800s through the 1500s. About 250 years, it lied under Spanish control. Remember, the Spanish kind of used it to fortify their empire from like pirates and stuff like that. And even during the colonial days, Georgia and Florida often kind of conflicted each other as the borderlands between the English and the Spanish colonies. But the desire to add Florida, we can kind of break it down for essentially three reasons. One is that this was a good place for one runaway enslaved people to escape. So a number, over the 250 years or so, those enslaved individuals that escaped from some of the most southern English plantations could go to Florida. Second reason was, Spain was weak and vulnerable. They had pretty much kind of neglected the area. This was on the very outskirts of the Spanish Empire, and so they didn't really have kind of a strong focus there. And the third one is that Florida could be valuable farmland. But on this valuable farmland, it was occupied by Native Americans. So there were several incentives for the United States to potentially annex Florida. Now, when the War of 1812 gets underway, the United States finds itself in a position where it's fighting against the British, but it's also fighting against potential allies of the British, including many Native Americans. And so there are a couple of skirmishes um, around the kind of Spanish Florida, Georgia area. Andrew Jackson, who was the hero of the War of 1812, after that war is over, after the Battle of New Orleans, actually brings American forces into Florida, into Spanish Florida. And this pretty much sparks off kind of the series of events, which eventually puts Florida in control of the United States. This conflict is known as the First Seminole War. So this is in 1817. We'll say troops under Andrew Jackson march into Spanish Florida and go to war with the Seminole tribe. Spain really kind of unable to protect their sovereignty, right? They can't stop Andrew Jackson from crossing into the border of Spanish Florida. They eventually decide that they're going to part with Spanish Florida. The Adams-Onis Treaty. This is an agreement between Spain and the U.S. I think we may have even mentioned this treaty back in the chapter on Andrew Jackson, but an agreement between the Spain and U.S. to give the U.S. Florida. Jackson's invasion allowed for Florida to be passed to American hands. So now Florida lies in possession of the United States. Part two, we might say, of this conflict is once settlers begin arriving. And as soon as settlers begin moving into Florida, that sparks another conflict, a second Seminole War. So this is now a war caused by U.S. settlement of Florida. All right, now not just the army of Andrew Jackson, but now that Florida belongs to the United States, now settlers are kind of eager to move in there. And it wasn't just the Seminole tribe or Native Americans. Certainly, the United States was fighting against Native Americans who inhabited that land. But at that point, there was also a considerable free black population, the descendants of those who had escaped in the area. And so one of the American generals, General Thomas Sidney Jessup, remarked on this and said, quote, of the Second Seminole War, it is a Negro, not an Indian war, emphasizing the role that the free black population in Florida fighting against American settlement played in that conflict. Florida would eventually, after settlement of the region, became a state in 1845. Right? Then Florida was officially added for statehood. Statehood required a certain number of people to live there, voting population. And so that's essentially in kind of a, in a nutshell, is how Florida became fully incorporated into the U.S. And again, you could think about manifest destiny in this period, and you could tell a similar story for, regions like Indiana or Iowa or, some of these other areas. Your textbook just chooses kind of Florida as the case example. Now, probably the most important part of this chapter, though, is the change in policy that the United States takes towards Native Americans, namely the passage of the Indian Removal Act, which marks, again, a pretty significant divergence from the way that the United States had interacted with Native Americans prior to this. So let's just go ahead and get the definition kind of down here. The Indian Removal Act is defined by your textbook as granting the president the power to negotiate with Native Americans to exchange land in the U.S. for lands in the West. And again, remember when we talk about the West, we're talking about west of the Mississippi River. So again, the big kind of change here, we might say, is that before this, you had more or less a policy of sovereignty, Sovereignty, / maybe assimilation. Assimilation was the idea that Native Americans ought to blend in with the rest of American society, and that's kind of a way of solving this Native American United States problem. Sovereignty was the policy that the United States had at the very beginning, starting with the US Constitution. That was to recognize Native Americans as being their own separate, self ruling people, right? They're separate from the United States. But in recognizing that Native Americans were separate, there was also an acknowledgement that they have the right to their own land, the right to their own laws. In other words, they rule themselves, which is what sovereignty is. The Indian Removal Act ends sort of this notion that Native Americans have control over their own destiny, especially those inside the United States, and also kind of closes the door to assimilation, right? The idea is that this is no longer the policy to be pursued, but now it's about simply removing Native American populations from within the United States. In the words of Andrew Jackson, the president at the time, who became a supporter of the Indian removal policy, he says, quote, "Removal will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites and perhaps cause them gradually to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community." So, at least in Jackson's speech here, he is still sort of having the door open to the idea of assimilation. But this won't happen within the United States, right? That's kind of an important door that's being closed here. Now, the focal point for the change in this policy ended up centering around the group of the Cherokee and the state of Georgia. Essentially, Georgia did not want to wait for an agreement. Right? They were not willing to kind of let Andrew Jackson hammer out the details, and they essentially wanted the Cherokee to be removed from their land immediately. You might say they sought to remove the Cherokee themselves. So essentially what we have is, on the one hand, we have the state of Georgia. We have on the other, the Cherokee. And lastly, we have, I mean, in essence, the U.S. president, but the federal government, right? So there's kind of three competing sources of political legitimacy, and historically, right, what the relationship between the Cherokee and the United States has been is typically between the federal and the Cherokee. Now they're in negotiations to remove, but Georgia wants removal now. Right, that's sort of their demanding. So the Cherokee sue, And there are two Supreme Court cases that eventually make their way to the highest laws in the land. The first one is the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. So now it's these two sides that are sort of in dispute with each other because, in some sense, this policy over Indian removal does sort of tend to play at both the state and federal level, right? They're both they're trying to fight for who gets to determine what happens to Cherokee lands. In this first ruling, the Supreme Court pretty much just said we don't have jurisdiction, right? Supreme Court said we don't have jurisdiction. In other words, they really didn't want to hear the case, right? They were trying to essentially stay out of it, we might say, in some way. But in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, this one was a lot different. This time, the Supreme Court said that Georgia's laws don't apply within Cherokee territory. So essentially, what the Supreme Court said was, look, in this disagreement, we're siding with the federal government, and we are not siding with the state of Georgia, right? Worcester versus Georgia was a ruling against the state of Georgia, saying, look, you cannot kind of remove the Cherokee yourself. Essentially, you don't have that power. Now, Andrew Jackson ended up being sort of at the center of this because he ends up having, in some sense, kind of the final say on the matter. And Andrew Jackson wanted to create, or we might say, wanted an agreement to move the Cherokee. And he eventually did make an agreement, but the Cherokee were split on accepting it. In other words, half of the Cherokee accepted it, half of the Cherokee did not. And the half that did not accept the agreement by the federal government to be removed for their land, they stayed there. So the Cherokee were split on accepting. We'll say some continued to reside on their lands. And so we have a quote here from John Ross. John Ross was one of the leaders of the Cherokee that refused removal. Essentially, had kind of two factions within the Cherokee. One agreed with the agreement to move, the other one didn't. John Ross said, quote, "You asked us to throw off the hunter and warrior state, to form a republican government, to cultivate the earth, to learn mechanic arts, to learn to read, to cast away our idols. We did so." So, in other words, up until this point, the United States had made a lot of demands for assimilation. And Ross is saying, look, we did all that. We've done everything that you've asked. But now you demand we cede to you our lands. That we will not do. So this is John Ross refusing removal. So after a few years, those that refused to relocate as part of the agreement that was made, they were forcibly relocated by the United States Army. And this event is known as the Trail of Tears. This is the forcible removal of wasn't only the Cherokee, but the Cherokee kind of tend to get the main focus here, from their lands in Georgia to what eventually became Oklahoma, or at this time we'll just say west of the Mississippi River. Of all the people that were forcibly moved, the Trail of Tears gets its name because during the forcible migration, there was harsh weather. There was also very sort of poor planning. And one more thing that we can add to this is difficult travel. Of the 16,000 or so that were forcibly relocated, only about 10,000 made it. Now, your textbook doesn't explicitly say that 6,000 died, but if you can do the math on what your textbook provides, you could say that at least 6,000 didn't make it along the forced migration. I know other statistics cite 4,000 dead, 6,000 dead, so it was a disaster, and probably of all of the kind of periods in American history between Native Americans and the United States, the Trail of Tears is probably the darkest or lowest point of U.S. Native relations. Now, again, that is subjective, so you might be able to make an argument for other periods, but certainly a low point in that respect. In total, 6,000 people were uh, forcibly moved. It didn't just apply in only the South, although Georgia, the kind of the battle between the state of Georgia and the Cherokee kind of got center stage, but removal took place in a lot of other states, as well. Now, there were some Native Americans in the West that remained out of the purview of at least kind of a very close and controlled American jurisdiction, at least for this antebellum period. And those were those ones who lived west of the Mississippi. Indian removal only applied to those east of the Mississippi. So any groups west of the Mississippi, there wasn't yet, not in this period, after the Civil War, yes, wasn't yet kind of the very strong control by the United States government, and one of those groups was the Comanche. And the Comanche, they adopted the horse very early. They lived primarily kind of on the southwest plains. And we can simply say about them is they remained independent, built somewhat of a empire of their own, independent. Their empire, Comancheria, I suppose is how you pronounce it. This is the Comanche Empire. And it really existed on the border of Mexico and the US. And oftentimes, what the Comanche would do is maybe, raid from, or this might be a better way of putting it, raid south, that is, go south to raid, and then trade north. And by being sort of the middlemen between Mexico and the United States in this area of the Southwest, the Comanche successfully carved out an empire of their own. Now, despite the fact that the United States is having a pretty significant change in terms of overall Native American policy, again, moving from sovereignty and emphasizing assimilation to just outright removal of Native American populations, there are going to be groups and organizations that do kind of hold out hope, maybe, on the idea of Native Americans assimilating or Americanizing and becoming kind of incorporated in American society. Americanization is just kind of another word for assimilation. So we might just say Americanization is the policy of Native American assimilation into US society. And again, kind of more, maybe more popular before removal. It's not that Indian removal would absolutely close the door on assimilation, but it would close the door pretty much anywhere east of the Mississippi River. Americanization would pop up again, kind of once we talk about manifest destiny moving even further and further west. But organizations like the Civilian Fund Act of 1819, this set aside funds for schools. And really, in a lot of ways, schools were really sort of institutions of assimilation. Section 3, Life and Culture in the West. So, as far as the experience that women faced in the American West, there are kind of two things that we can take note of. The first thing is to kind of remember the way in which culture and stereotypes and expectations were held for men and women in kind of the dominant American society. And this is a term that we've used several times. And it's this notion of separate spheres, sometimes also referred to as the cult of domesticity or the cult of womanhood. And so the first point we're going to make is that, yes, these ideas that regulated kind of behavior between men and women still existed in the American West, but we could say that at times the idea and culture of separate spheres did not, or we'll say, was maybe not as strong. And so your textbook kind of provides an example that whereas kind of in middle class urban society in the north or even southern society in the south, things like setting up the homestead, right? The type of physical labor that would be required to something like build a house or farming, right? Farming was typically defined in the male realm in the culture of separate spheres, but women could find themselves as farmers. So the types of gendered stereotypes weren't as powerful in the West as they were in other areas. The second point we can make is more about demographics, and that is the fact that for the most part, when it came to demographics, not always true, but for the most part, there were more men than women in the West. And so what this allowed for is that wives, we could say wives or women and wives, say made more demands and had, say, more leverage over men and husbands because women were less present in the West. It meant that as a wife, you could make more demands on your husband, kind of like a supply and demand, maybe have more power in one's relationship. Now, one of the things making westward expansion a little bit easier is the improvements in transportation. This will make, say about transportation, improvements makes settling the West cheaper, faster, and safer. Now, kind of an important point to make about these improvements in transportation is that for the most part, this will get you to the West, but it won't get you quite into the West. And what we mean by that, or kind of a note that we can make, is that transport could get one to the Mississippi, right? And the Mississippi River was the border between, the West and the rest of the United States. But once you got to the Mississippi River, then pretty much you're going by covered wagon. But over the years leading up to the American Civil War, again, just getting to the Mississippi was made a lot easier. So, what types of things made that easier? Well, federal infrastructure projects. The National Road was a federally funded road from more or less the Chesapeake Bay to the Mississippi River. And there's a point here to make that, by the time of the American Revolution, American transportation is rather underdeveloped. Americans had really been only trading or been connected commercially with England. And so once the American Revolution was over, there wasn't a lot of internal infrastructure. And the national government was very hesitant to even engage in any type of infrastructure projects. The National Road is actually one of the very few, if not the only, federally funded transportation project, and it made getting from the Chesapeake to the Mississippi River all that much easier. It was just a road, right? Instead of having to go through the wilderness, but it helped facilitate that. Other projects include canals. If you're not familiar, a canal is a man-made river. And canal construction made it easier to go from, one body of water to the next, or from one river to the next. The most famous by far was the Erie Canal, built in 1825 in New York. It was the largest canal in the world at the time that it was built. And it connected essentially the Atlantic Ocean via the city of New York to the Great Lakes, right? That you could take a boat across the Erie Canal, go all the way across New York, end up in the Great Lakes, and end up in cities like Chicago. Now construction made it easier to get from point A to point B. And lastly, and again, railroad construction really begins to boom after the Civil War, but probably more so than any other method of transportation, railroads do end up becoming the most efficient. And so again, on the point about railroads, we'll say cheap, safe, reliable transportation. Section 4, Texas, Mexico, and the United States. And in this section, we probably get to what's the most important part of this chapter, and that is how both the state of Texas and territory that had belonged to Mexico becomes annexed or added to the United States. So this is a story that first begins with Texas, and Texas at the time of American westward expansion belonged to the country of Mexico, but before it was Mexico, it used to be Spain. We might say that Spanish Texas became Mexican Texas in 1821 with Mexican independence. And, in kind of the same way that the English colonists broke away from the British crown, you had a very kind of similar thing happen in Latin America where they broke away from a Spanish crown. In 1821 was the year that that happened. So Texas went from Spanish control now to Mexican control. And for the most part, Texas was kind of a sparsely populated area, didn't really have a lot of significance in terms of like economic development or, hold sort of a large population. But it did serve as we might say, a border. Let's say served as a maybe buffer is the better term here. Buffer territory for the Comanche. Remember, we talked in the previous section about the Comanche and how they really controlled the region between the United States and Mexico at this time. And serving as a buffer, serving as kind of a sparsely populated area without a lot of development, Mexico wanted to attract settlers to the region. And many settlers that were looking for land in the United States, or many settlers looking for land, came from the United States. Most of them were ethnically what we're going to define as Anglo. And so, again, just to kind of help us differentiate between the different demographics and population groups that end up moving to Texas, typically when we refer to Anglo populations, we mean those that speak the English language and those that adhere to Protestant Christianity. We'll say Protestantism. Whereas the predominant ethnicity in the Spanish Empire and Mexico at the time would have been Hispanic, and that is a Spanish speaking Catholic population. So there does tend to be a cultural and ethnic difference between settlers coming from mostly the United States into Texas and the people who live in Texas or lived in Texas under the Spanish and the Spanish Empire and later Mexico. And so a lot of Anglo settlers moved into Texas. Anglo settlers might just say that many Anglos moved to Texas. And what was initially a desire, right, wanting to attract settlers, to create a buffer state, to create a territory in Texas that could make more money. Suddenly, a lot of these outside settlers provided the Mexican government with some problems. We might say caused some tension. So, for example, in Mexico, Mexico had banned or outlawed slavery. Despite that, slaves were brought in. That served as a point of contention. A second point of contention was that Mexico, we'll say, demanded settlers become Catholic, right? As long as they convert to the Catholic Church, that would be kind of a way of maybe assimilating these Anglo settlers into Mexico as a broader country. Many did not. So the fact that many of these people came in, they didn't become Catholics, they were bringing their slaves with them. They had different understandings and notions about things like criminal justice and the law, and they didn't always get along with kind of the local jurisdictions in the area. You definitely had some tension building up in the region. In fact, so much so that 1830, Mexico completely turned course and banned immigration to Texas. But by that time, pretty much, the ship had sailed as they speak, and there was a large Anglo population in Texas, and kind of agitating, um, and tensions building, right? And tensions building. Now, at the time, the Mexican government was not in the most kind of stable position. In fact, the general Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna essentially took control of the country in 1834. So he took control of Mexico in 1834. And while he took power, he certainly worked to, and your textbook uses this term, repudiated. Let's see how we spell that. REPUD, repudiated, apparently. Uh, Repudiated the Mexican Constitution. Essentially, Santa Anna was attempting to take over more or less like a dictator, right? He wanted to run Mexico as a ruler. And so when Santa Anna repudiated the Constitution, like effectively canceled out the government and was sort of vying for sole control of the country, these Anglo settlers in Texas, who would refer themselves as Texians, um, took that opportunity to declare independence. And these series of events are known as the Texas Revolution. The Texas Revolution is the successful secession of Texas from Mexico, leading to the independence. And sort of interesting here because of kind of the historical precedents, but leading to the independent Republic of Texas. And the independent Republic of Texas, this is, in essence, the only US state to exist as an independent nation. There's going to be a time period where the country of Texas exists as completely separate. No other state can really claim that. There were a couple of states that might have claimed they were independent, but nobody recognized them. And that really is kind of the bottom line when it comes to declaring yourself a sovereign nation. And for that reason, Texas is nicknamed the quote unquote Lone Star state. And they were a Lone Star because they sat all by themselves as their own independent country for, I don't know, about 9 years or something like that. Texians, these were the people, we'll say, in support of the revolution, breaking away from Mexico, primarily Anglo in nature, and definitely opposed Santa Anna. And it's the opposition to Santa Anna that really is primarily the root of violence that occurs. In 1836, Texas declares independence. Mexico and Santa Anna send an army to crush the rebellion. In other words, Santa Anna is not going to allow Texas to just break away, kind of under his watch. And so he sends an army, and you do have a series of skirmishes and battles that take place. It's not really a big war or a huge war, but certainly some battles that are worth knowing. Probably the most famous battle of the Texas Revolution is the Battle of the Alamo. It was, in fact, in this battle that Mexican forces really just crushed a Texian, I think is how you pronounce it, forces. The Battle of the Alamo became kind of a very popular A very popular point of reference, in fact, for the rest of the war, Texans or Texians will say the slogan, "Remember the Alamo." Essentially, it was a battle in which all of those that were fighting against the Mexican government more or less fought to the death. They were all killed there. However, though, eventually Texian forces would gain the upper hand at the Battle of San Jacinto. Texians led by Sam Houston, who is somewhat of a hero of these series of events, appropriately where the name Houston comes from, the city of Houston in Texas. Not only defeated, but actually successfully captured Santa Ana. And by capturing Santa Ana, that was essentially secured Texan independence. Santa Ana was forced to sign the Treaty of Velasco, which, amongst other things, said that Mexico is to withdraw from Texas. And it forced Santa Ana to recognize independent Texas. So Santa Ana had to agree that Texas was now, look, Texas is no longer part of Mexico. You have to agree to that. And of course, Santa Ana had to agree because he got captured. However, though, with that being said, the Mexican government did not recognize independence. And this is going to be a major source, and in fact, the cause between a war with the United States and Mexico, right? It kind of all has to do with Texas. In the meantime, though, the question is now that Texas is an independent republic, the question is should Texas be added or annexed to the United States? And, from the get go, a lot of people had hoped that Texas would join the US. After all, most of the people that moved there were Americans, right? In some sense. I mean, they called themselves Texians and have this sort of Texan national identity, but they were from the United States. And, if anything else, the United States could offer military protection by the use of the US Army. So that was always kind of lingering in the minds of those there. So the people in Texas wanted to join the US, knowing what we know about American history. It should always be the case that the United States wants to annex more territory. However, though, the question of Texas annexation went on for 9 years. So Texan annexation, this is the question. If the United States should add Texas. This went from, 1836 was the declaration all the way until 1805. So Texas stood on the sideline for about 9 years before the United States finally decided to add it. So the question is, well, what the heck was holding the country up, right? Why were they not willing to add Texas when everything we've ever learned about American history up to this point tells us that typically when the United States is offered the opportunity for territory and land, they jump on it? Well, two things. One was that it could start a war with Mexico. And that, of course, was in the short term, maybe a concern, right? You don't want to offend the Mexican government, maybe to avoid a conflict. However, though, the bigger issue, and this really kind of provides us a little bit more insight in terms of the trajectory by which the nation is heading, is that Texas would would disrupt the balance of free and slave states. And of course, there were many Northerners, and maybe we'll just kind of make a note here. The Northerners objected to adding a more, I mean, not just in terms of slave state, in terms of political power, but more, we'll say, potential for slavery. Right? So there are a lot of Northerners saying, like, hold on a minute. Do we in the North really want to add what would become the largest slave state in the Union? And the answer was no. And so, kind of one of the things that is important to understand about this and how it sort of ties to national politics is that, you know, the situation with Texas and the situation with Mexico, this has the effect of reviving the debates over slavery. And you can imagine the next kind of question that people in Congress are asking themselves is that, okay, as we add more and more territory, as we incorporate Texas into the Union, um, now we have to talk about the legality of slavery in that area, and then slavery becomes sort of the focal point now instead of, economic policies or westward expansion or whatever it might be. Now, Texas remained in limbo for 9 years, and no president up until that point was really wanting to risk it, mostly because they knew that bringing up Texas in the Congress would ignite the division between Northerners and Southerners until James K. Polk. And James K. Polk is one of the more interesting presidents, I would say, in U.S. history. He won the presidency in 1844. And his platform or his position was manifest destiny. I mean, he was kind of a very straightforward candidate. When you think or hear the name James K. Polk, automatically think manifest destiny. This guy is the manifest destiny president. And when he was running, he wasn't just talking about, oh, elect me and I'll add Texas. I mean, Texas was part of that. But he said, elect me and I'll add Texas, I'll add Oregon, and I'll add California. Right? I will make manifest destiny complete. And he was somebody who, leading up to the election of 1844, was a complete nobody. Nobody knew who he was. But when he came forward and said, elect me, I'll add it all, and then he won that election, that sort of had the effect of kind of uh, making politicians a little bit more bold when it comes to Texas annexation. And so, in fact, even though Polk wasn't technically the president that added Texas, it was added by his predecessor, John Tyler. But the only reason why Tyler did that was because he knew how popular Polk was, and the fact that Polk won the election on saying, I'm going to add Texas. It kind of gave him the okay to do that. And so with that, in 1845, Texas was added, 1845, and became the largest slave state in the Union. Again, technically by Tyler, but Polk is our manifest destiny guy. The hope that Mexico would not be offended by this did not go over well. In fact, we have this quote here. It says, quote, an act of aggression, the most unjust which can be the most unjust which can be found recorded in the annals of modern history. This is Mexico's opinion on the Texas annexation. And more specifically, where the disagreement lie between Mexico and the United States now was this very sort of thin strip of land in which both the United States and Mexico claimed it was there. The Nueces Strip, and I have no idea if that's pronounced correctly, but the Nueces Strip was a disputed piece of land on the Texas, now part of the United States, Mexican border. Again, both US and Mexico claimed it. So this would eventually be the reason why these two nations would go to war with each other. Now, remember that Polk had promised Texas, Oregon, and California. In fact, Polk's first effort to attain California was to offer to buy it from Mexico. But because the United States, or because Mexico viewed the annexation of Texas as being so unjust, right? And the most unjust, the offer to purchase California was rejected, right? The United States made an offer, said, look, we'll buy California from you. Polk, I made the promise that I would get California. Let me go ahead and just buy it from you. When that was rejected, Polk sent the American general Zachary Taylor and 4,000 American troops into the disputed territory. So Zachary Taylor, he is a U.S. general. Sent to, we'll say, guard the Noosa Strip. And what happened there was that he was attacked by Mexican forces. Again, according to Mexico, this is their land. According to the United States, it's our land. And 11 were killed. So it's when Taylor is sent with 4,000 troops down to the disputed territory. Gunshots break out, 11 Americans are killed. This becomes the reason and justification for the United States to declare war against Mexico. Coming from James K. Polk in 1846, in the aftermath of 11 soldiers being killed, he says, quote, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. This slogan right here, shed American blood upon American soil, this becomes the U.S. war cry. Right? This is the justification. This is what Americans said. This is why we're declaring war. Polk goes on to state, she, as in Mexico, has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are now at war. And so now, quote unquote, Mr. Polk's war was underway. Of course, this is referring to the Mexican-American War. Again, they called it Mr. Polk's War. At least critics of the war did, because they believed that Polk had provoked this conflict. The Mexican-American War, and it was fought between 1846 and 1848. Now, as far as the fighting goes, your textbook really doesn't go into all that much detail as far as the actual battles. To be quite honest, they're not all that important. Zachary Taylor certainly is kind of one key figure to take note of. He ends up becoming the war hero of this conflict, which paves the way for his presidency. He's kind of like George Washington and Andrew Jackson in the sense that they were generals and then ran for president. But the general actually responsible for the conquest of Mexico and Mexico City is General Winfield Scott. So this is a U.S. general who captured Mexico City. And as a result, we could say that the U.S. won the war. And the ensuing treaty was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This ended the Mexican-American War. The most important or significant part of this treaty was that the territories of California, your textbook goes into more detail about all of these lands, but Utah, Nevada, right, etc., go to the U.S. All right, so one of the big things that the United States got from this is territory. It's sometimes referred to as the Mexican Cession, although I didn't catch your textbook using that specific term, but this is the land that Mexico is forced to surrender to the United States. A little bit later, the United States also purchased some land more diplomatically, we could say. The Gadsden Purchase we'll say an additional purchase of Mexican land. This was made a little bit later, 18, oops. And when you consider everything that Polk did during his presidency, which added Texas, or we'll just sort of list this stuff out. So Texas was successfully added. California was successfully added via conquest. It's not mentioned, but Oregon also comes in the United States. That in large part, President Polk accomplished manifest destiny. And he did it in just 4 years as president, right? He's maybe one of the more important one-term presidents that we've ever had, meaning that he's only served 4 years. But he had a very busy presidency, right? All of these lands were brought into the United States. Now, what are the consequences? What are the consequences of the Mexican-American War and manifest destiny being achieved? Well, in some ways, in a global context, it's definitely put the U.S. on the path to a global power. Certainly in the Western Hemisphere, right? The United States emerges out of this conflict as certainly the most powerful nation on the Western Hemisphere, more powerful than Mexico at the very least. Like we mentioned before, Zach Taylor would eventually become president. You have kind of the same war hero turned politician thing happen as a result of this conflict. For Mexico, it was not great. Mexico lost about 1/2 of their land. Your textbook states this. I'm actually curious exactly how much square mileage that was. But most importantly, and we'll put this in a separate color just to describe the significance of this issue here. And this is, of course, as an American history class, the most important thing that happened to it is that as soon as the Mexican cession came in, the natural follow-up question was, okay, so we got California from Mexico. Follow-up question is, okay, is slavery going to be legal there? And so after the Mexican-American War was over, it revived what would eventually become very destructive issue of slavery, right? Revive the issue of slavery once again. On to the last two sections, section 5 and 6. Section 5 is Manifest Destiny and the Gold Rush. So immediately following the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, gold was discovered in California in 1848, the same year that the Mexican-American War ended. And the consequence of that is that thousands of people moved to California in hopes of becoming rich. Right? This is called appropriately, the gold rush, right? When, just make note, when people rush to a location on the discovery of gold. The one that happened in California in 1848 is not the only gold rush, but it is kind of the most recognizable one. In fact, if you just use the term, if you just say the gold rush, most of the time you're referring to the one that happened in California in 1848. Now, the consequence of a huge influx of people moving into one area. So, for example, cities like San Francisco grew from, it's hard to imagine that this statistic is accurate, but in 1848, cities like San Francisco had 500 people. By 1853, so just add 5 years later, that had grown to 50,000 people. So, population surged And one of the consequences, and it's not quite touched upon in this section, but we'll definitely come to it in a later section, is that California becomes ready for statehood. And I mean, no question mark here. I mean, it's ready to be a state before anybody ever anticipated. And of course, with statehood comes the question of, will it be a free state or will it be a slave state? So that's going to be kind of lurking in the background. One thing that's also worth mentioning about the West more broadly are the different types of demographics of people who move there. And typically, we say the American West, there were five ethnic groups represented that at times could conflict with each other. So there is the Anglo migration there. We might call this white or European migration. Um, African Americans, especially after the American Civil War, once slavery is abolished, a number of African Americans view the West as an opportunity and move there to a lesser degree before the Civil War, but certainly have a presence. There is a stronger Native American presence in the West. And the kind of demographic groups that are maybe more unique are an Asian or Chinese presence and a Hispanic presence. And typically, around most of the United States, you could probably find, kind of, Anglos or Europeans, whites, African Americans, Native Americans. You can find those in other regions, but only in the West do you have a significant Asian or Hispanic population. And again, like I mentioned earlier, that could lead to various types of ethnic conflicts. This is a political cartoon showing you that I think what it's trying to show, it says Uncle Sam may be swallowed by the foreigners, and I assume this is a Chinese immigrant on this side. This is looks like an Irish immigrant of what they might be depicting. It says the problem solved, and problem solved is by one immigrant group eating the other, essentially. So this point about California statehood, remember this for some of the upcoming chapters because that's going to kind of start a whole new series of events. The last section, though, here is the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine has more to do with kind of foreign policy a little bit. We think about westward expansion as being something that happens solely within the United States, but we have to remember the West wasn't considered America before, 1848, at least, the part that was acquired by Mexico. So the Monroe Doctrine kind of refers more to foreign policy stuff. So we have a quote here by John Quincy Adams that kind of captures the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine. It says, quote, her, and he's meaning America, her glory is not dominion, but liberty. She has a spear and a shield, but the motto upon the shield is freedom, independence, and peace. And this sort of represents, especially this kind of symbolism of spear and shield, of America's like more aggressive posturing in the international realm. And that's essentially what the Monroe Doctrine was, right? If we want to define it, this was the effort by the United States to, let's see, we'll say, yeah, to keep out European countries from the Western Hemisphere. The United States was very much cautious about, Spanish involvement. A lot of revolutions had kicked out the Spanish. There was fear that the Spanish might come back. They were worried about the French coming over, worried about the English coming over. And, with that kind of symbolic shield and spear with liberty and freedom on the shield, the United States is kind of telling European countries, like, kind of stay on your side of the world. Now, at this time, the United States was not quite in a position to fully, let's say, defend that. But nonetheless, it does kind of give the United States a little bit of a posturing against the rest of the world. Now, in terms of other American expansion, it did occur on a limited basis in Latin America. You had this phenomenon known as filibustering. And filibustering was when private US citizens, so this is not the US government, attempted to annex territory. This famously happened in Cuba. However, though this failed, we might say some Americans tried and failed to annex Cuba. But the more famous example was Nicaragua. And in Nicaragua, some guy named William Walker established, I don't know if independent is the right word, we'll call it established a regime and imported slavery, trying to carve out a part of Nicaragua that would be essentially under William Walker's rule. Walker would eventually be executed. You know, the Walker, I don't know what you want to call it, the Walker regime also failed. But they're kind of interesting stories or events in which Americans kind of, again, without any approval of the United States government, are, you know, trying to annex or add more territory. Now, this chapter concludes with, again, and probably if there was one point to take away from this chapter, especially, you know, moving forward, is no matter where the expansion was, whether it was Texas or California or Cuba or wherever it was, there was one fundamental problem that plagued the United States in every single territory that it added. And if you can guess it at this point, you are on the right track. And that, of course, is what is the status slavery. And we will learn very shortly here that this question will eventually send the United States down the path of civil war.